8th century BCE, the Hebrew prophet Isaiah protested in the vivid language that prophets like to use his people's short-sighted religious practices and attitudes, characterizing the inadequacy of their self-centered communal commitments. He raged, "For the bed is too short for a person to stretch himself out on, and the sheets are too narrow to wrap oneself in them." Isaiah 28:20. Old ways and inherited values, he said, were no longer adequate to the situation in which the people found themselves. This passage prompts me to ask, what is the religious situation in which we live? And are we perhaps endeavoring to rest ourselves on short beds and to wrap ourselves in too narrow sheets? What is the religious situation in which we live in the first years of the 21st century? The question I'd like to consider is this: can religion, which has so often divided people and set them in opposition to one another, serve the common good in the 21st century? Can people motivated by religious convictions offer resources that address the dramatic problems of American public life and the world? I suggest, another way of putting that question, I suggest that the most important question facing the 21st century is this: is it possible to be passionately committed to one's own religion and at the same time humble about its universal truth claims? This question has been made utterly urgent by recent terrorist activity ostensibly based on religious convictions. The dangers of religious fundamentalisms that encourage people to identify with religious ideas and to shape the self ruthlessly around those ideas have never been so vivid. I repeat, is it possible to be passionately committed to one's own religion while remaining humble about its universalizing truth claims? Consider first the present situation of religion in American public life. Americans are becoming increasingly religious, though many Americans shy away from thinking of our commitments as religious because they are critical of some features of religious institutions and people. But America is no longer what Will Herberg 50 years ago called a three-religion country, namely Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism. In the rapidly changing American religious landscape, mosques and temples dot the horizon, not only in Manhattan and Berkeley, but also in Phoenix, Detroit, Toledo, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Several years ago, Professor Diana Eck at Harvard University published a study entitled On Common Ground: World Religions in America. The book provides a directory that includes Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain temples, Islamic centers, Sikh gurdwaras, Baha'i temples, pagan groups, and Zoroastrian centers. Professor Eck also found, as she surveyed religions other than Christianity and Judaism in America, that religious loyalties are increasingly shaped by ethnic identities. And I'm quoting from her study. There are Hispanic Baptists, Chinese Catholics, and Thai, Vietnamese, and Cambodian Buddhists. Los Angeles has over 200 Buddhist temples with congregations from all over the world. New immigration has brought Jewish immigrants from Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. These religious groups do not exist across the vast geographical distances from one another as just a short while ago they did. I quote On Common Ground again. A Muslim community center, a Ukrainian Orthodox church, a Disciples of Christ church, and a Hindu temple are virtually next-door neighbors on Hampshire Avenue in Silver Springs, Maryland. A Vietnamese Buddhist temple and a Baptist church are neighbors on the same road in the outskirts of Oklahoma City. A Lutheran church and a Buddhist temple are across the street from one another in Garden Grove, California. End quote. We are neighbors, and to recognize this new situation is to realize that some of our assumptions about being religious, individually and in communities, need examination. For the diversity of American religious life is rapidly creating a new, demanding, and exciting situation. What does it mean to be religious in a society in which one's own religious convictions are not broadly shared? Can religion serve the common good rather than act as an isolating and self-aggrandizing force? Can people of diverse religions find warrants within their own religion for working together with those of other religions to create social and economic justice in America and the world? Can a liberal interest in broad individual freedoms be modified by commitment to the common good? In his book, Diversity and Distrust, Civic Education in a Multicultural Democracy, Stephen Mikado cites religious enthusiasms alongside tribalisms of various sorts as dangers to liberal democracy. His view of religion as divisive and potentially dangerous to the common good is shared, I think, by a multitude of Americans. It is a reputation well earned historically. And presently, religion's divisiveness can be documented in any number of places across the globe. Both outsiders and insiders often view religion as essentially, at the core, partisan, irrational, and unconcerned with the realities of people's lives. This caricature of religion will need to be overcome, well earned though it may be, if religion is to serve the common good. Mikado warns that we must not ignore the amount of what he calls moral convergence that it takes to sustain a constitutional order that is liberal, democratic, and characterized by widespread bonds of civic friendship and cooperation. Before such moral conversion can be approached, religious people of all persuasions will need to undergo a great deal of self-scrutiny. I'll return to this point in a moment with some suggestions. The situation of religions in America cannot, however, be understood in isolation from that of the social health of the nation. For it is in the context of a needy world that religious people are prompted to form alliances across religious differences. In the words of the Hebrew prophet Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Mark and Mark-Louisa Mirengoff's 1999 book, The Social Health of the Nation, How America is Really Doing, argues that while news media are constantly monitoring and reporting the nation's economic health, there are few and episodic reports of the nation's social health. Reporting is not publicly and regularly available on the well-being of America's children and youth, the accessibility of health care, the quality of education, the adequacy of housing, the security and satisfaction of work, and the nation's sense of community, citizenship, and diversity. If such social data were regularly reported, the authors say, Americans would have to acknowledge that despite a booming economy in the last years, several key social indicators have, quote, worsened significantly over time and are currently performing at levels far below what was achieved in previous decades, end quote. From 1940 until 1970, social indicators increased as the gross domestic product increased. Since 1970, however, the gross domestic product has increased 140%, while social indicators decreased by 38%. I'm quoting now from the Mirengoffs. Suicide rates among the young are 36% higher than they were in 1970. Income inequality is at its worst level in 50 years. More than 41 million Americans are without health insurance, the worst performance since records have been kept. Violent crime remains almost double what it was in 1970, corrected for population. Average wages for American workers have fallen sharply since the 1970s, despite the strong economy. Child abuse has increased dramatically, and approximately 1 in every 5 American children lives in poverty, a 33% increase since 1970. Now, when these figures are compared in the same categories with other industrialized nations, it is evident that Americans are not doing all we can to improve our social health. America is at or near the bottom among other advanced industrialized countries in many social indicators. For example, although the infant mortality rate improved steadily throughout the 20th century, 20 industrial nations have fewer infant deaths in the first year per 1,000 births than the United States. Moreover, infant mortality varies significantly in America by race. The rate among African Americans is more than twice as high as the white rates, a proportional gap that is higher than the one in 1970. Social indicators such as I've described relate directly to religious values. Their marginalization from news media reporting makes it more difficult for religious people to understand why and how we should engage as religious people with social issues. For example, human life and its flourishing is a core value in Christianity, still the majority religion of the United States. Christianity's founder and exemplar, the Word made flesh, spent much of his short ministry career healing and feeding people. In the 5th century, Augustine articulated a theological basis for social action. Preaching on 1 John 4:16, he drew a close connection between the God who is love and the Christian's most essential responsibility. And how is love for God to be practiced? Through love of the neighbor, Augustine said, making clear that the neighbor should be interpreted in the broadest possible way. Theological warrants for social activism are not lacking within Christianity, but practical application is often much less evident. Although the alleviation of human misery has been a social agenda that first appeared in the Hebrew Bible, addressing the need for structural change is much more recent. At the end of the 18th century, John Wesley was the first theologically motivated social activist who advocated and implemented structural social change. In the American media, The word Christian is not commonly associated with loving concern for the common good. Indeed, it is difficult, if not impossible, for a liberal Christian to publicly identify her concern for social justice as Christian without risking misunderstanding. The designation Christian has been appropriated by the Christian right. And the right is far more aware than our liberal Christians that we live in a media culture in which diverse interpretations of what constitutes a Christian perspective are collapsed into those of the loudest voices. I'm disturbed by the co-optation of the category Christian by the Christian right. A complex and diverse range of interpretations exist on the question of what it means to follow Christ in our time and place. However, Mark Silk has recently reported an unexpected aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks. His article is in the Religious Studies News of 2002. He writes, "The American news media has taken great pains to differentiate the faith and patriotism of American Muslims from the apparent religious convictions of the airplane hijackers. Church and community groups across the nation have taken pains to educate their members to the fact that Islam is a complex religious tradition, most of whose adherents are in no way interested in launching terrorist attacks. Television has also played a large role as commentators from Oprah to newscasters have been saying the same thing. As a result, a survey conducted by the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press found that, quote, the proportion of Americans with a favorable view of Islam increased from 45% in March 2001 to 59% in November 2001. Silk concludes, the message has evidently been getting across. That's a really startling documentation, I think, of the power of the news media. Is there work for religious people to do in America? The statistics I cited a moment ago, even allowing for all the problems of statistics, speak eloquently for themselves. But can America's social health be addressed as if it were solely a problem for Christian social ethics? Indeed, there's a strong tradition of Christian social thought in the 20th century, but it is presently evident that if Christians are to influence American society in the direction of social and economic justice, we will need to work with people of faiths other than Christianity who also have a large stake in American public life. How then can people of different religions form alliances with people who do not profess any religion to address the social health of America? That process, I believe, involves self-scrutiny and the willingness to relinquish some religious habits that we developed in the context of nations that were comprised of one dominant religion. In our changed and changing situation, the short beds and narrow sheets of our religious attitudes no longer fit and must be revised. Growing up the daughter of immigrant fundamentalist parents, I inherited some religious attitudes that I now think are unhelpful, even dangerous, at the beginning of the 21st century. I speak then from a long process of identifying what I'll call some old ways of being religious and I must speak from within my own religion, which is Christianity. Then I'll explain why it is still, and more than ever, both necessary and important to be religious people. First, in a religiously diverse society, what it means to be religious is changing. The struggle to believe and to believe in a dogmatic system is no longer quite at the center of what it means to be a religious person today. From John Bunyan in the 17th century to the existentialists of the 20th century, the anguished intellectual struggles of individuals to believe difficult doctrines have occupied much of the literature about religion. But religious communities are not primarily communities of people who believe and think in unison. They are communities of people who come together to encourage one another, to egg each other on, to live out, to body forth their commitments to religious worldviews and values in very practical and concrete ways. Insight into specific teachings can occur through practicing religious commitment in such communities. Second, if religion is to serve the common good in the 21st century, religious people must recognize the danger of religious chauvinism, whose most blatant form, of course, is religious wars. Most religions have a shameful past in which religious coercion has been practiced whenever there has been the power to do so. It's time to notice that people of different religions have more in common with one another than do people who claim no religious orientation. But sibling rivalry lingers and can be a very potent form of conflict, as anyone who grew up in a family knows. Can religious and cultural diversity become an asset as religious people imagine and then implement the common good? A more subtle form of religious chauvinism than religious wars has been prevalent in scholarship about religion. In the mid-20th century, theologian Paul Tillich pointed out that scholars tend to describe their own religion on its most profound level, while considering other religions on their most superficial levels as, quote, futile human attempts to reach God, end quote. Yet, it is possible to believe strongly in the divine revelation of one's own religion while still recognizing that its beliefs and practices emerged in history as human efforts to give form and substance to that revelation. As human products, then, religious beliefs, practices, and institutions are always in need of critical scrutiny. We must continually ask, do our religious institutions, language, and rituals effectively body forth our trust in the generous and life-giving heart of the universe? When we question religious chauvinisms based on the claim to possess truth, we come face to face with the need to revise our understanding of what religion is. What if, instead of thinking about religions primarily as defined by beliefs, we were to think of religions as based on communities, worldviews, and practices that encourage their members to treat each other in certain ways? If, for example, we understand the center of reality as a loving, life-giving energy, we'll realize that we must treat one another and all living beings with respect and responsibility. When we think of religions as providing orienting pictures of a greater whole in which all living beings are interrelated and interdependent, we'll not worry so much, perhaps, about possessing the only truth. We will become interested, indeed fascinated, by others' ways of describing and practicing their commitment to the good of the whole. We will come to understand the ultimate mystery in which we live and the richness of considering our own religious identities in conversation with people of religions other than our own. For finally, the diversity of American public life is not merely to be tolerated. It is a profoundly exciting opportunity to learn from and delight in our religious differences. The third old way of understanding religion that I think must be questioned if religion is to serve the common good is the assumption that religious and social values necessarily confirm and support one another. Historically, indeed, religious warrants have been regularly invoked to sanction social arrangements, economic policies, political stances, and gender roles and expectations, and assumptions about race and class. But in the context of American public life, a religious identity should challenge rather than reinforce the values of our consumer and entertainment culture. Consider an example from my childhood for a moment. My parents placed John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress on my bedside table and urged me to read it. I sometimes did when nothing more exciting was available. The Pilgrim's Progress, a 17th century devotional manual that was a bestseller for centuries, offers some not so subtle gendered instructions for living a Christian life. When the protagonist, Christian, receives training in how to conduct his Christian life, he is taught to be on the alert for and to fight against adversaries of all sorts. About halfway through the book then, Christiana, Christian's wife, sets out for the celestial city, and she is similarly instructed in how to live the Christian life. She is taken, in her instructions, to a shed where a sheep is being slaughtered. And her instructor says to her, "You must learn of this sheep to suffer, and to put up with wrongs without murmurings or complaints. Behold how quietly she takes her death, and without objecting, she suffers her skin to be pulled over her ears." End quote. These devotional instructions supported and reinforced rather than challenged gender socialization in 17th century England. A deliberately chosen and cultivated religious life should instead provide an alternative perspective from which to look critically at one's socialization and one's society. Finally, among what I'm calling old ways of being religious, I suggest that some forms of traditional and contemporary spirituality do not contribute to the common good. The word spirituality is often used today as an antonym to religious, as in, I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual. What does this statement mean? It could mean that the person rejects religious organizations, but acknowledges some of the values ordinarily associated with them. Or the person who claims to be spiritual but not religious may avoid religious community and practices, instead thinking of spirituality as essentially disembodied, a transcendence of body by mind. It could and often has meant disconnecting one's spirituality from any political and social responsibility. No spirituality should help us transcend the needy world in which we live, a world that requires our attention, our affection, and most of all, our work. Christianity has traditionally been very concerned about the danger of attachment to power and possessions, but the equal dangers of resignation, passivity, cynicism, and indifference to the suffering and struggle of other living beings have not been articulated with the same force as those other dangers. To be sure, the possibility of transcending our immediate circumstances is, in some situations, a useful insight. But as a statement about what Christianity most centrally is, it is dangerous. Similarly, Christians often emphasize the power and majesty of God in ways that de-emphasize human responsibility. Theologies that focus on humans' childlike dependence on God can fail to challenge Christians to mature acceptance of responsibility and accountability. In the last presidential election, over 50% of eligible Americans did not vote. And perhaps an even more alarming statistic is that among 18 to 24-year-olds, voter participation was below 30%. Among Western-style democracies, the United States is 52nd of 58 in voter participation. The feminist philosopher Dorothy Dinnerstein once wrote, "We never feel as grown up as we expected to feel when we were children." And because we do not always, or perhaps often, feel confident and capable, we evade responsibility. Yet we are the grown-ups. It's time to collect from the litter of old ways of being religious what I see as the particular importance and excitement of being a religious person in our society and world. First, I defined religion in a way that highlights not beliefs and institutions, but relationships within and across communities and among all living beings. Religion is about how we care for one another, for life in its many forms, and for the earth's precious and vulnerable resources. Second, I suggested that we need to think of religion as offering resources for vivid and passionate engagement with our needy world in collegial conversation with religious others. Third, I urged that we distinguish between our religious commitments and our socialized assumptions and attitudes. Finally, I urged that we resist disembodied spiritualities and accept the responsibility of working together to address the urgent needs of our unjust world, for there's a great deal of work to be done. Having discussed several short-sighted attitudes that I inherited from my fundamentalist upbringing, I should acknowledge an attribute of fundamentalist religion that I continue to prize and have endeavored to bring with me through rather radical changes in my religious convictions. That quality is passion. I miss, in much of liberal Christianity, the passion with which my parents held their religious loyalties. I do find this passion, however, in the socially centered Christianity of Walter Rauschenbusch at the beginning of the 20th century. That tradition is alive and well today in a variety of social movements, from religiously motivated sociological movements to political activism. Religiously motivated ecological movements to political activism. The task of finding common ground from which to imagine the common good does not, I believe, require that Americans adopt a religious melting pot identity. The distinctive character of each religion must be maintained, even strengthened. Americans can learn to describe our own religions articulately and, yes, passionately, while yet listening attentively and respectfully and learning from others' descriptions of their religious worldviews and values. As a Christian, I must ask, what does it mean to follow Christ in a religiously plural society? And I must trust that others will ask, what does it mean to follow the Prophet Muhammad or the Buddha? Or what does it mean to be a faithful Jew in a religiously plural society? In short, I believe that a new humility must inspire everyone's efforts to relieve the social ills of American society. We must exhibit a new willingness to work across religious barriers, beyond mainstream Protestantism and Catholicism, and beyond Christianity, with people inspired and motivated by religious beliefs and practices that we do not share. The challenge for Christian theology is to identify and articulate the theological reasons for social concern and activism in cooperation with religious others. As so frequently in the history of Christianity, practice is once more preceding theology. Myriad local cooperative ventures among churches, temples, congregations are already in process and have been for at least the last 15 years. At the end of the 1984 sociological studies, Varieties of Religious Presence, Mission in Public Life, the editors of this volume offer their reflections on their study of socially active congregations in relation to those that are not socially active. Their cautious conclusion, I think, is very instructive. A congregation, they say, quote, though profoundly shaped by social context and social class of its members, can, in a limited way, transcend the determinative power of its context, end quote, by invoking values from its religious tradition. Neither religious beliefs or social factors completely determines the other. Now, this is a critical finding. Its importance, I think, cannot be overestimated. What it means is that people can, to some extent, transcend our social conditioning of our class and social location when the values of our religious traditions are presented to us with articulate passion. Religious traditions provide one of the few alternative perspectives that Americans have from which to examine and remedy the social health of our nation and our small planet. It is our religious traditions that urge us to look beyond the gross domestic product, the Dow Jones, and the index of leading economic indicators, to assess how we're doing as a nation. At the age of 100 years, at the close of a richly productive life, the 19th century African American educator Anna Julia Cooper wrote, "It's not what you say or even what you do that matters. It's what you stand for." end quote. Becoming a person, a community, or a nation unified enough to stand for something is not easy in a culture organized by consumption and pacified by entertainment. In fact, however, we are mistaken if we think that personal and communal integration has ever been easy. Becoming a person or a society that can stand for something is and always has been a project, a specifically religious project. For we do not, finally, have the prerogative of not being religious. Our loyalties, our longings, our goals, and our actions effectively organize and direct our choices. Whether acknowledged as religious or not, they constitute our working religion. We can be religious in ways that are isolating and self-serving, or we can be religious by working to spread the gifts of love, beauty, and life to all living beings. It is, finally, an exciting and demanding time to be a person with religious loyalties and commitments. In the rich religious diversity of our nation and world, let us accept the responsibility of grown-ups to work together to address the needs of our nation and world. Let us seek the conversations that help us to recognize, to appreciate, and finally to delight in the many ways of seeking and bodying forth the sacred that surround us in the 21st century. Thank you. Well, yeah, that isn't an answerable question, but thank you for it in terms of sharpening what we need to be thinking about. One perspective that helps me on days when I feel discouraged is to look at the long history of the world and to recognize that we have come some part of the distance, and rather rapidly. For example, the authors of the Declaration of Independence did not really mean even that all men are created equal. But the rhetoric, the beautiful rhetoric, well, it could be improved on, but the rhetoric of their statement has gradually begun to work on us, I think. And we have begun to use it. All kinds of people who have been exploited and marginalized are using that rhetoric now in ways that suddenly make us realize what that rhetoric means. So on days when we feel overconfident and like, oh, we're just about there, then we need your message. And on days when we feel discouraged, I think we do need to look at a greater awareness, I think, among some people, how to put it cautiously, not too dramatically, but definitely something there that is progress over the melting pot mentality of the early, really 18th century Americans, in which all the white races bonded in this melting pot mentality over against African Americans. So, slowly. Okay, I'm negatively inclined, as you so delicately put it, against the aspect of transcendence that encourages us not to look at anything disturbing, not to work on anything, but to escape into religious and or secular entertainment is a kind of transcendence as well, to escape into modes of attention that remove us from the realities of the people we live among.
Okay, now would you include among those meditative states which are used for introspection?
No, insofar as they energize coming out of those states with more motivation. And I think that, I am a historical theologian, and I think that I have found that emphasis in all kinds of mystics from Meister Eckhart forward, in which he retells the Martha and Mary story, which is so interesting. Everyone has always thought that Mary, who sat there and listened and sort of reveled in hearing Jesus speak, was the desirable position. He retells it. He says Mary hadn't gotten as far as Martha. Martha had been there and come out of that to be doing the work. That's an important question, and I think there are many locations, political and social, where, in ecological movements, there are many places that people who have no direct religious loyalties, but still are motivated to social action, of peace and justice action of various sorts. So it happens, it isn't necessary to have a religious loyalty to be concerned about the planet and the people and other living beings on it. But I think that an important feature of all religious commitments is community, and that community really does help. I think any of us could feel terribly discouraged, terribly fast, if we thought we had to do anything meaningful alone. So the community is an important part of that motivation, I think. Well, oddly enough, the language around monasticism and the early ascetic movement in the 4th century, which I've studied at some length, the language, the reviewer language often emphasizes withdrawal from the world. But when you actually read monastic rules and other writings from those movements, the monks did not think of themselves as withdrawing from the world. They thought of themselves as providing an incredibly important social service, namely upholding the fabric of prayer on which the whole society depended. So in their view, they were social activists. Though not participating in business and, other secular things, they were convinced that they were doing a very important thing for society. They didn't, you're speaking of centuries past, I assume, and those people lived in a different world and had different perspectives. I wonder what they would do now, and we do see in monasticism, contemporary monasticism, male and female, a great emphasis on different kinds of social work. I don't think anyone feels content to sit on a mountain and just contemplate anymore, if ever they did. Well, I think that being critical of one's society, and preferably one's own religious group first, is not is not a hostile act. I mean, some of the people that I know that care most about Christianity, for example, are some of the most critical because they love it. They can't stand to see the offenses that still occur within the perspectives of people who claim their perspectives to be Christian. So I think that a lot of that one can criticize as strongly as one needs to, out of the spirit of love, of wanting things to be better.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall.